Hi, I'm Reed, this is Krylin Publishing, and today we're going back to our series on inspirational material, sources that you can use to inspire and influence your game. And today we're talking about the Coldfire Trilogy novels. Excellent books. So in the 1990s, a lady by the name of C.S Friedman, Cecilia Friedman I think her name is, wrote two ordinary science fiction novels. And then she wrote something really quite remarkable. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the Coldfire Trilogy. It's one of the most remarkable SF novels I know of. Technically, it's SF. You might call it space fantasy. You might call it hard fantasy as well. I just call it gothic fantasy myself. Get into it, but mainly because the main character is cool, sexy Dracula. If Dracula was a fantasy hero, and it's also it's a throwback to the early days of the weird literature, the 1920s stuff before the classifications and the genre margins between science fiction and fantasy and horror became a lot more concrete like they are today. And I think that for class-based fantasy games especially, it is one of the most important and inspirational sources you could ever draw on. So we're going to talk about that today. So let's get to it. That's my dog. She walked in during shot. Go away. Okay, you can stay. So alright, let's start out with the world building. 1,000 years ago, a colony ship from Earth lands on a planet called Now Erna. There, they discover there's a force on the planet that's basically magic, and they call it the Fae, F-A-E. The Fae is basically an invisible psychic field that is generated at the planet's core, and it shoots up through its many volcanoes and fault lines. And the Fae is, it's magic. It changes reality when it's acted on by a sentient mind consciously or unconsciously. Now, the colonists take a little while to understand what the hell is going on with the Fae, and they only figure it out after there's a few hundred years of boogeyman, goblins, monsters just appearing, monstrously bad luck, gods begin to appear and want worship, and they eventually figure out that all that unconscious fear, all the religious impulses, all the childhood boogeymen, all the irrational imaginary creatures and outcomes that we are all a prey to, that's what's coming true. That's what's happening. And I think one of the better examples in the book is that there's a fantastic scene where you learn that one character's mother was an alcoholic, and someone just says in passing one day about her, she's got worms in her brain. And the little kid, he can't shake that image. And one day he walks out on his mum. Mum? And of course her head is exploded because she has worms in her brain now. His unconscious fear and just childhood fascination with that particular image made it happen. His poor mum died because of his fears about her. And then of course the brain worms slither off to hunt other people. And because the Fae don't just die, and the fake constructs don't just die, they become real. They're real things afterwards, and you can deprive them of Fae and destroy them, but until you do, they are real, and they live off human flesh, and they live off human emotion. And of course, over time, babies start being born who can see the Fae and use it. But guess what? They're babies. Their obsessions are bad. Their ability to use the Fae is bad. It gets much, it's worse when what they eventually call adepts start being born. So basically, humanity is living on borrowed time because we cannot just get over our own fears. And then someone figures out that the Fae can be used consciously, but it's very difficult for humans to use this alien force. But they figure out that it will respond to human imagination and to human religious impulses. So this person makes a sacrifice, blows up all the technology that is left on Erna. And this is this is Jesus and Odin and Ra. You give up your most precious things for your survival. And this enormous power of sacrificing the human legacy of technology. And it works. The Fae is still wild and hard to control, but ultimately sorcery appears in the world. That's where the ability to use magic comes from. And when we've got the ability to use the Fae, humans are okay on Erna. And I think that you are already beginning to see the uses for this for your D&D games. And then, eventually, knowing that sacrifices work, a young man by the name of Gerald Tarrant figures out that if you can control human spiritual impulses, human shared beliefs, human rituals and prayers, you could create a church. And in time, over hundreds of years, you could make the Fae completely tamed and scientific and predictable. And more importantly, you could create a monotheistic God who ruled that world entirely and who loved humans, and you could create an afterlife for humans. So they're trying to create a church. And it starts to work because this Tarrant guy is a genius. They call him the prophet. He's incredible. They make him a prince. They make him a lord. The only problem is that Tarrant is dying. He's got something wrong with his heart. He's just living on borrowed time. And a proud man, he feels that only he can shepherd humanity. Only he can see through this project. So he starts to use the Fae. And this is sorcery. This is where sorcery really takes off. But then he realizes that even that's not going to save him. So he sells his soul to the dark Fae. He sells his soul to the intelligence deep behind the most evil impulses of the Fae, some dark god. And so he has to sacrifice his wife and kids. And then he becomes a vampire. He becomes like a hunter of women who lives off human fear and death and blood. And the church eventually covers up his corruption. And they go, well, the prophet was killed by the hunter, that sort of a thing. But really, with this powerful sacrifice that he's made, he's become the world's most powerful sorcerer. So we jump ahead in time a few hundred years, and those adepts, the kids are born now. They're pretty standard. There's one in every town or a few in every town. They're quite handy to have around. And the church has become the only thing that sort of links humanity, because now with the Fae safe, they've spread out over 2 continents. And the book begins when the church is just carefully trialing sorcerers. They're not really very comfortable with Fae magic yet, but they are men and women who are being indoctrinated into church dogma, but they're also trained in sorcery and Fae magic, and it's a very controversial program. And even though the church doesn't know it, it's because they're afraid of Tarrant. They're afraid of Tarrant's sorcerous powers. They think that led him into darkness. And of course, the church is actually an important part of these books, because it's one of the main characters is one of these guys who's learning how to use sorcery, and he's a fighter. He's in game terms, he's absolutely a paladin, because he's like a tough guy who's also a religious dude, but he's also pretty good with his 2-handed sword. And if they do it all right, if the church succeeds, Erna will be made safe and heaven will exist. And that's where the book starts off. The priest Vrice meets an adept, and then they have to go and meet the hunter. And the hunter, of course, is Tarrant, the evil sorcerer, and something's trying to kill everyone. So they've all got to team up and take it on. It's fantastic. You will love it, I promise. So let's talk about the Fae. So the Fae, in many ways, is really an attempt to take on a kind of D&D style magic that's predictable, that's scientifically understandable, and is a force that has rules. It's a kind of physics like weather or magnets or revolution. And ultimately the goal of many of the characters in the books is to somehow understand this magic. And throughout the book, we see it used like high fantasy magic is used. It is used to heal people. It's used to fight monsters. You work, which is the sort of an enchantment term. You work a sword into the Fae, and that's a magic sword. You work a teacup into the Fae, and the teacup will never break. It's just a very, very handy kind of technology that is used on every level of societies. And of course, it's become a kind of magitech. And throughout the book, they go to different parts of the world, and depending on what the local conditions in the Fae are like, and the local conditions of the church are like, but sometimes it's very little more than medieval technology, and sometimes they get up to a kind of 18th century technology. I think that at some point you even see a combustion engine. So Fae is ultimately a kind of a magitech, and I think that you could steal Eberron ideas for magitech. It's just a really, really useful explanation for why there is magic and why there are so much different kinds of magic as well. I think that one of the things that I really like, and I would love to work this into a game myself one day, I never figured out how to do the rules for it, but it's very easy to overcharge on magic. It's very easy to take in too much Fae, and if you do, you're holding onto an electric cable. So you can die very, very horribly, and it's something that comes up throughout the books. In fact, one of the main characters in the first book tries it out with hilarious results. So ultimately, humans have a very difficult relationship with Fae. Maybe one day it will be as predictable as electricity, because all this magitech can still go wrong with the wrong kinds of emotions, the wrong person at the wrong time. It's not 100% safe yet. But that is a long time coming. That's the prophet's plan. Slowly but surely, over generations, change this world. Will humans stick to the prophet's plan? Will they save humanity? You might if you like, share, and subscribe. So what's gameable in these books? Obviously, before we talk about gameability in these books, you need to decide, is it if you do want to do a straight adaptation, or do you just want to be heavily influenced? I personally always think that influence is better. Part of the fun of a game of D&D, part of the fun of an RPG, is making it your own. But let's begin. Firstly, obviously the most gameable thing is that D&D is a very, very high magic setting. This is a very, very high magic setting. Every single character class in D&D 5e has magical powers, or at least access to magical powers, and the Fae is a way to unify all those powers, if you like. Even arcane and divine in this world of the Coldfire Trilogy, they're just different disciplines. They're just different ways of using the same power. And there's, in D&D terms, this could be a reason why monks can run up walls. They specifically are physical adepts of the Fae. Barbarians really can talk to spirits because they've just learned how. Bards really can alter reality with songs so beautiful they convince you that they have changed reality. And of course, some people, we talked about them before, adepts are just born with it. That's a sorcerer. Many clerics know their god personally. There's absolutely no doubt or mystery that gods are just fey creatures. They're just manifestations of human emotions. And like classical gods, there's gods of wisdom, there's gods of fear, there's gods of love, there's gods of marriage, there's gods of farming. Any human activity will eventually create a fey spirit. And some other clerics think that these guys are pagans because some are trying to create God, some are trying to make God manifest sometimes in the future. And so they draw on this beloved spirit to come one day. That's why paladins can pallor, that's why rangers can do magic. The Fae gods and spirits grant people power all the time. And so do demons. Demons are just Fae creatures that do evil. And the main character, the Dracula character, Tarrant, is ultimately, he's a warlock. He has done a deal with a terrible, terrible Fae spirit. And the other thing is that church is really a strong idea. If only to see how a church can work in a kind of points of light idea, because there's two human continents. Everyone is surrounded by monstrous enemies. There are inhuman creatures. There are Fae monsters. There's all sorts of terrible things on the planet. But the church is what keeps humanity united. The church is what keeps humanity together. And eventually you discover that the church is corrupt. At least some of the church is corrupt. So I think that's very, very cool. And as well as there's an endless source of adventures, because it's always helping people. It's always doing exploring. It's always doing all sorts of stuff. And I think that the idea that all humanity has a racial purpose is a great hook for a campaign. And of course, there's tension. Not everyone believes in the future for God, and not everyone trusts adepts, which in D&D terms, again, are sorcerers. They're the guys who can see the Fae naturally. Some humans become wizards, which is suspicious because they have to learn to use the Fae. Warlocks, well, we talked about those. And even the bad guy is a 20th level illusionist. And there's a really, really clever take on how he can use that power to master all of human senses. There's a fantastic bit where he hides the sun from a vampire, and then he hides the pain from the vampire even knowing that he's on fire. It's quite cool. And for no other reason than that class stuff, I highly recommend these books to you. What does classes look like to PCs and NPCs? What does it look like to people who are within the narrative fiction themselves? Check it out. I think that it will really give you some ideas of what your stories look like to the people the stories are happening to. But this is such a cool setting for an RPG. It really, really is. This is a world in which humans are not only adapting to incredible new dangers, but wherever we go, we make our own. There's so much for PCs to do. Fae outbreaks and Fae activity does happen, and it does cause great pain to us. There's a fantastic scene where they find a tribe of children who've been living by themselves out in the wilderness for a long time, and they've been warped by the Fae. And who they really are is very, very, it's a worrisome reveal. Kingdoms fall to the whispers of demons and mad sorcerers and adepts. Eventually we discover that the church is being corrupted and what that actually means for the people and for the souls of the people around them. There are monsters to hunt because, these monsters don't die. Unless you kill them, they just keep getting older and bigger and badder. The settlements to be found. And then, here's a little bit of a spoiler, eventually the characters discover that humans are not the only aliens even on this planet. Some demons are very old, have a very dark origin, and after a few thousand years, they are very powerful indeed. And of course, there's loads of stuff like the Fae eventually does change fauna and flora, so there's monstrous forests, there's intelligent races who are growing, so you could definitely call demi-humans and humanoid monsters, give them a shared origin. They're just a mutation of the Fae. A gnoll is just a dog. Someone was scared of a dog one day, or a hyena, and then eventually that began to mutate the entire race of dogs. Sauergrin is just a shark that someone was scared of. Or someone said, oh, I wouldn't like that shark to jump on land. Haha. Oh no, 2 generations later, he's got thumbs. Bloody hell. So it's such a great unifying mechanism for world building. So what does the Coldfire Trilogy give you as a DM? Well, it gives you a the Fae idea is such a strong idea. It's such an interesting way to look at magic in a D&D terminology. It is such a unique mechanism for world building, to explain character powers, to explain demons without having to deal with that complicated cosmology, to bring in any monster that you like, because you can be afraid of anything. You don't really need to worry about a unifying aesthetic, because you just say, it just appeared. The Tarrasque just appeared today. The purple worm just appeared today, because people had fears of that sort of stuff. You have a world filled with all sorts of exciting danger. You've got the landscape itself is changing. You've got monstrous forces are growing all the time, have not stopped growing all the time. And you have this unifying racial ideal that one day the world doesn't have to be this dangerous. One day we can fix this. So even though on all sides everything seems quite dark, and these are dark books, not for people getting stabbed in the eyes and stuff all the time, just emotionally quite dark, there is this beautiful story of optimism at the heart of it. And I think that a D&D campaign is, of course, almost always a story of optimism, that you can change the world. And I think that is the heroic part of heroic role-playing. Did you like this? I hope that you did. My likes have been going, my views have been going terribly recently. So why don't you tell some friends to watch this, because I have a good time doing this. And I will see you soon. I love you, C.S. Friedman. Bye-bye.